The Ape Canyon Incident by David Eden. Chapter 1. The Mountain's Secret. The morning mist clung to the Cascade Mountains like a shroud, and Charlie Brennan should have taken that as an omen. But miners, especially the desperate kind working the remote claims near Mount St. Helens in 1924, didn't have the luxury of heeding omens. They had quotas to meet, families to feed, and dreams of striking it rich that burned brighter than common sense. Charlie spat into the dirt and adjusted his suspenders, the familiar weight of his pickaxe comfortable against his shoulder. The other four members of their crew, Pete, Dutch, Sam, and young Billy, were already moving up the trail toward what they'd come to call Ape Canyon. The name had started as a joke, something about the way the wind howled through the rocky gorge like a primate's cry. None of them were laughing about it anymore. "Something ain't right up there," Pete had said the night before, his weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed deeper in the firelight. "Been finding tracks, big ones, bigger than any bear I ever seen." Dutch had scoffed, but Charlie noticed how his hand kept drifting to the rifle propped against his knee. "Bears get big up in these parts, Pete. Mountain air makes everything grow." "These weren't bear tracks," Pete insisted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Had 5 toes. Long ones, like fingers." The memory of that conversation followed Charlie up the mountain path like a cold shadow. The forest seemed different today. Too quiet, as if the usual chorus of birds and small creatures had suddenly decided they had somewhere else to be. Even the wind had stilled, leaving only the sound of their boots crunching on the rocky trail and the distant rumble of the mining equipment they'd hauled up here weeks ago. Their cabin sat in a clearing about halfway up the canyon, a rough-hewn structure that had seen better days even when they'd first claimed it. The previous occupants had left in a hurry, abandoning tools and supplies that suggested their departure hadn't been planned. Charlie had asked around town about them, but folks got a funny look in their eyes when he mentioned the cabin in Ape Canyon. "Some places," old Tom Weatherby had said, shaking his grizzled head, "some places are better left alone." But Charlie and his crew weren't the type to be spooked by local superstitions. They were practical men who believed in what they could see, touch, and dig out of the ground. The gold they'd been pulling from the canyon walls was real enough, even if it came with a side helping of unease that seemed to thicken with each passing day. As they reached the cabin, Billy suddenly stopped, his young face pale beneath his mining cap. "You smell that?" Charlie inhaled deeply. There it was, a rank, animal smell that made his stomach turn. It was like nothing he'd ever encountered, a mixture of wet fur, rotting meat, and something else. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Probably just a dead deer," Sam said, but his voice lacked conviction. They'd work the claim today, just like always. They'd extract their gold, count their earnings, and try to ignore the feeling that something was watching them from the tree line. But as Charlie looked up at the towering pines that surrounded their little clearing, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone on this mountain. And whatever was sharing their space wasn't interested in being neighborly. The mountain had secrets, and Charlie Brennan was about to learn that some secrets were better left buried. Chapter 2. Signs in the Earth. The first rock hit the cabin wall at 3:17 a.m. Charlie knew the exact time because he'd been lying awake, staring at the pocket watch his father had given him, listening to the sounds that weren't quite sounds coming from the forest. The impact against the wooden planks was like a gunshot in the mountain silence, and all 5 men bolted upright in their bunks simultaneously. "What the hell?" Dutch started, but Pete's sharp whistle cut him off. They'd developed a system over the past weeks, a series of hand signals and quiet sounds that meant listen or wait or something's wrong. Pete's whistle meant all 3 at once. Outside, something was moving through the underbrush with the confident stride of a creature that had never learned to fear anything. The footsteps, and they were definitely footsteps, not the 4-legged gait of a bear or the scurrying of smaller prey, circled the cabin like a predator testing its territory. Billy, barely 19 and still soft from his mother's cooking, pressed his face against the single window. "I can't see nothing," he whispered. "Too dark." Another rock struck the cabin, this one against the roof. Then another. The impacts came with deliberate rhythm, like someone testing the structure's weak points. Charlie found himself thinking of the stories his grandmother used to tell about the old country, about creatures that lived in the spaces between the known world and the dark places where reason went to die. Could be kids from town, Sam suggested, but his voice carried no conviction. The nearest town was 40 miles of treacherous mountain road, and no kid with any sense would be wandering around these peaks in the middle of the night. Kids don't throw rocks that size, Dutch muttered, examining the dent in the wall where the first projectile had hit. The impact had left a crater the size of a man's fist, and wood shavings littered the floor. The footsteps stopped directly outside their door. Charlie's mouth went dry. Whatever was out there had to be massive to make the ground shake with each step. He'd seen brown bears in these mountains, creatures that could weigh 600 pounds or more, but this was different. This was purposeful, intelligent. A sound came from outside that would haunt Charlie Brennan for the rest of his life. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, then rose to something that was part howl, part scream, and part something else entirely. It was the sound of rage given voice, of fury that had been building for centuries and finally found its target. "Jesus Christ," Billy whimpered, and Charlie couldn't blame him. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the canyon walls until it multiplied into a chorus of inhuman anger. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the cabin's exterior walls, starting at ground level and rising higher than any man could reach. The sound was like fingernails on a chalkboard, but magnified tenfold. Whatever was making those marks had claws, and it was using them to test the cabin's defenses. "We need to see what we're dealing with," Charlie said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear. Fear had a way of focusing a man's thoughts, stripping away everything non-essential until only survival remained. Pete nodded and carefully lifted his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. The weapon looked pitifully small in his hands, like a child's toy brought to face a nightmare made flesh. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, Charlie could hear his own heartbeat, his own breathing, the quiet prayers that Billy was muttering under his breath. The mountain held its breath, waiting. Chapter 2, Signs in the Earth. The first rock hit the cabin wall at 3:17 a.m. Charlie knew the exact time because he'd been lying awake, staring at the pocket watch his father had given him, listening to the sounds that weren't quite sounds coming from the forest. The impact against the wooden planks was like a gunshot in the mountain silence, and all 5 men bolted upright in their bunks simultaneously. "What the hell?" Dutch started, but Pete's sharp whistle cut him off. They'd developed a system over the past weeks, a series of hand signals and quiet sounds that meant listen or wait or something's wrong. Pete's whistle meant all 3 at once. Outside, something was moving through the underbrush with the confident stride of a creature that had never learned to fear anything. The footsteps, and they were definitely footsteps, not the 4-legged gait of a bear or the scurrying of smaller prey, circled the cabin like a predator testing its territory. Billy, barely 19 and still soft from his mother's cooking, pressed his face against the single window. "I can't see nothing," he whispered. "Too dark." Another rock struck the cabin, this one against the roof. Then another. The impacts came with deliberate rhythm, like someone testing the structure's weak points. Charlie found himself thinking of the stories his grandmother used to tell about the old country, about creatures that lived in the spaces between the known world and the dark places where reason went to die. "Could be kids from town," Sam suggested, but his voice carried no conviction. The nearest town was 40 miles of treacherous mountain road, and no kid with any sense would be wandering around these peaks in the middle of the night. "Kids don't throw rocks that size," Dutch muttered, examining the dent in the wall where the first projectile had hit. The impact had left a crater the size of a man's fist, and wood shavings littered the floor. The footsteps stopped directly outside their door. Charlie's mouth went dry. Whatever was out there had to be massive to make the ground shake with each step. He'd seen brown bears in these mountains, creatures that could weigh 600 pounds or more, but this was different. This was purposeful, intelligent. A sound came from outside that would haunt Charlie Brennan for the rest of his life. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, then rose to something that was part howl, part scream, and part something else entirely. It was the sound of rage given voice, of fury that had been building for centuries and finally found its target. "Jesus Christ," Billy whimpered, and Charlie couldn't blame him. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the canyon walls until it multiplied into a chorus of inhuman anger. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the cabin's exterior walls, starting at ground level and rising higher than any man could reach. The sound was like fingernails on a chalkboard, but magnified tenfold. Whatever was making those marks had claws, and it was using them to test the cabin's defenses. "We need to see what we're dealing with," Charlie said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear. Fear had a way of focusing a man's thoughts, stripping away everything non-essential until only survival remained. Pete nodded and carefully lifted his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. The weapon looked pitifully small in his hands, like a child's toy brought to face a nightmare made flesh. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, Charlie could hear his own heartbeat, his own breathing, the quiet prayers that Billy was muttering under his breath. The mountain held its breath, waiting. Chapter 4. The Siege. The barrage began at dawn. Charlie had been watching the horizon through the cracked window, praying for the first hint of sunlight to send their tormentors back to whatever hell had spawned them. But as the sky lightened from black to deep purple, the attacks intensified rather than ceased. Rocks rained down on the cabin like hail from a thunderstorm conceived in Satan's own mind. The creatures had positioned themselves on the canyon walls above, using their elevated position to devastating effect. Each impact sent shockwaves through the small structure, and Charlie could hear the wooden beams groaning under the assault. "The roof won't hold much longer," Pete shouted over the din, pointing to where a section of planking had already splintered. Daylight streamed through the gaps, along with smaller stones that scattered across the floor like deadly confetti. Dutch pressed his back against the wall, his face pale and drawn. "How many of them are there?" "Too many," Sam replied grimly. He'd been counting the different angles of attack, trying to triangulate their positions. "At least 4, maybe more. They've got us surrounded." Billy huddled in the corner, his rifle forgotten on the floor beside him. The boy had broken sometime during the night, retreating into himself as his mind struggled to process what was happening. Charlie couldn't blame him. This wasn't the kind of thing they taught you to handle in Sunday school. A particularly large boulder struck the door, splitting it down the middle. Through the gap, Charlie caught a glimpse of movement, something large and dark shifting between the trees. The creatures weren't just throwing rocks, they were testing the cabin's defenses, probing for weaknesses like a military unit executing a tactical assault. "They're smart," Pete said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Smarter than any animal has a right to be." The bombardment paused for a moment, and in the sudden quiet, Charlie could hear something that made his blood freeze. Voices. Not human voices, but something that might have been communication, guttural sounds that carried the rhythm and cadence of language. "They're talking to each other," Dutch whispered. Sam shook his head violently. "Animals don't talk. They can't." His words were cut off by a new sound, wood splintering. One of the creatures had found a weak spot in the cabin's construction and was systematically dismantling it, board by board. The methodical nature of the destruction was somehow more terrifying than the chaotic rock-throwing had been. "We need to fight back," Charlie said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "We can't just sit here and let them tear the place apart around us." Pete nodded, checking his rifle. "The window's our best bet. We can get a clear shot from there." But even as they made their plans, Charlie knew they were facing something beyond their understanding. These weren't ordinary animals driven by hunger or territorial instincts. These were creatures that possessed intelligence, coordination, and a level of malevolence that suggested they were capable of true hatred. The assault resumed with renewed fury. More rocks, larger ones this time, began to rain down on the cabin. The creatures had learned from their previous attempts, adjusting their aim and timing to maximize the damage. It was like being caught in an avalanche, except avalanches weren't personal. This was. Through the broken door, Charlie saw something that made his heart stop. One of the creatures was approaching the cabin directly, moving with the confident stride of something that knew it had already won. It was even larger than the one Dutch had seen earlier, its massive frame silhouetted against the morning sky like a vision from mankind's darkest nightmares. "It's coming," he whispered. The creature reached the cabin's front wall and placed one enormous hand against the wood. Charlie could see the individual fingers, long, thick, and tipped with claws that could rend flesh from bone. The hand was almost human in its proportions, but scaled up to impossible size. Then the creature began to push. The entire cabin shuddered as the thing tested its structural integrity. Wood creaked and groaned, and Charlie realized with growing horror that their shelter wouldn't hold much longer. The creatures had been patient, methodical, but now they were ready to finish what they'd started. "God help us all," Billy whispered from his corner. But as Charlie watched that impossible hand pressing against their wall, he wondered if God was listening, or if he'd already decided that some corners of his creation were too dark for his light to reach. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The cabin's death throes began with a sound like the world's spine snapping in half. Charlie watched in fascination and horror as the creature's massive hand pressed against the wall, its fingers splaying wide to distribute the pressure. The wood began to bow inward, the nails holding the planks together shrieking as they were slowly pulled from their moorings. This wasn't the frenzied attack of a wild animal. It was the deliberate demolition work of something that understood leverage and structural weakness. "Shoot it!" Dutch screamed, but Pete was already raising his rifle, his hands trembling so badly he could barely aim through the broken window. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, and for a moment, Charlie thought they'd won. The creature's hand withdrew from the wall, and there was a roar of pain and rage that echoed through the canyon like thunder. But their victory was short-lived. The answering roars came from all sides now, a chorus of fury that made the walls vibrate. Whatever they'd done to one of the creatures, the others took it personally. The rock bombardment resumed with a vengeance, but now it was accompanied by something worse. The sound of multiple sets of hands testing the cabin's defenses. "We just made them angry," Sam said, his voice hollow with despair. Billy had retreated so far into the corner that he seemed to be trying to merge with the wall itself. "They're going to kill us," he whispered. "They're going to tear us apart." Charlie wanted to tell him that wouldn't happen, that they'd find a way out of this nightmare, but the words died in his throat. The truth was written in the splintering wood around them, in the growing gaps in the walls where claws had found purchase, in the way the entire structure swayed with each impact. Through the largest gap in the door, Charlie caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. The creature Pete had shot was still standing, dark blood matting the fur on its shoulder, but it was very much alive, and it was looking directly at him with eyes that burned with intelligence and an almost human desire for revenge. "It's not even badly hurt," Pete said, his voice cracking. "I put a rifle bullet in it from 20 feet away, and it's not even badly hurt." The implications of that statement settled over them like a funeral shroud. These creatures weren't just intelligent and coordinated, they were incredibly resilient, built to survive in ways that defied everything they thought they knew about the natural world. A new sound joined the cacophony of destruction, the rhythmic thudding of something heavy against the cabin's rear wall. The creatures had divided their forces, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. It was military strategy executed by beings that shouldn't have possessed such tactical knowledge. "The back wall's going to give," Dutch reported, pressing his ear to the wood. "They're using something like a battering ram." Charlie's mind raced, trying to find some strategy that might save them. But every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. They were trapped, outnumbered, and facing enemies that possessed advantages they couldn't hope to match. The front wall began to buckle. The creature Pete had wounded was back, and this time it brought friends. Charlie could see multiple sets of hands working in coordination, pulling at the loosened planks with a patience that was somehow more terrifying than mindless rage would have been. They were taking the cabin apart systematically, professionally, like craftsmen working in reverse. "We need to run," Charlie said suddenly. "When they break through, we run for the trees. Split up. Some of us might make it." "Make it where?" Dutch asked. "We're 40 miles from town, and these things know these mountains better than we do." But the alternative was waiting to be torn apart in the ruins of their shelter. At least running gave them a chance, however slim. The back wall collapsed with a sound like the world ending. Through the gap came the morning light, and silhouetted against it was the largest creature they'd seen yet. It had to duck to fit through the hole it had created, its massive frame filling the opening like a living wall of muscle and fur. When it straightened to its full height inside the cabin, its head nearly touched the ceiling. The creature's eyes found Charlie's, and in that moment, he understood something that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't random. This wasn't territorial. This was personal. The mountain devils had chosen them specifically, and they weren't going to stop until every last one of them was dead. "Now!" Charlie screamed, and what was left of their group scattered like leaves in a hurricane wind. Chapter 6. The Hunt. Charlie's legs carried him through the forest with a speed born of pure terror, branches whipping at his face as he crashed through the underbrush like a man possessed. Behind him, he could hear the others, Pete's labored breathing, Dutch's cursing, Sam's boots pounding against the rocky ground. But Billy's voice was absent from the symphony of their flight, and Charlie tried not to think about what that meant. The creature's roars echoed through the canyon, multiplying off the rock walls until it sounded like the very mountains were screaming. But underneath that inhuman chorus, Charlie heard something worse, the sound of pursuit. Heavy footsteps that shook the ground, moving with the steady rhythm of hunters who knew they didn't need to hurry. "This way!" veering toward a narrow game trail that led deeper into the forest. "We can lose them in the thick trees." But even as they ran, Charlie knew they were fooling themselves. These creatures had lived in these mountains for God knows how long. They knew every trail, every hiding place, every escape route. The miners were playing a game they couldn't win, on a board they didn't understand. A scream tore through the forest behind them, human, agonized, and suddenly cut short. Dutch stumbled, his face going white. That was Billy. "Keep moving," Charlie ordered, hating himself for the words even as he spoke them. But stopping meant dying, and dying meant Billy's sacrifice would be for nothing. They reached a small clearing where the morning sun broke through the canopy, and for a moment, Charlie allowed himself to hope. Then he saw the tracks. They were everywhere. Massive footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, each one easily twice the size of a man's boot. The prints formed a rough circle around the clearing, as if multiple creatures had stood here recently, waiting, planning. "They knew we'd come this way," Sam whispered, his voice hollow with despair. "They herded us here." The realization hit Charlie like a physical blow. The creatures hadn't been chasing them, they'd been guiding them. Every turn they'd taken, every path they'd chosen had been anticipated. They were cattle being driven to slaughter, and they'd been too panicked to see it. A shadow fell across the clearing. Charlie looked up to see one of the creatures standing on a rocky outcrop above them, its massive form silhouetted against the sky. It wasn't the wounded one from the cabin, but something even larger, its arms hanging past its knees, and its head tilt as it studied them with the detached interest of a scientist examining specimens. "Don't move," Pete breathed, raising his rifle with agonizing slowness. Maybe it hasn't. The creature's head snapped toward him, and Charlie saw intelligence blazing in those dark eyes. It had heard every word, understood every gesture, and it was amused. The thing opened its mouth and made a sound that was almost like laughter, a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. Then it cupped its hands around its mouth and called out in a voice that shook the trees. The answer came from 3 different directions. "Run," Charlie said quietly. "Where?" Dutch asked, his voice cracking. "Where can we go that they won't follow?" But Charlie was already moving, crashing through the underbrush toward what he hoped was the main trail back to civilization. Behind him, he could hear the others following, their breathing harsh and desperate. And underneath it all, the sound of pursuit, not hurried, not frantic, but steady and implacable as the tide. They ran for what felt like hours, their lungs burning and their legs screaming in protest. The forest became a blur of green and brown, punctuated by the occasional flash of movement in their peripheral vision. The creatures were pacing them, Charlie realized, staying just out of sight but never falling behind. When they finally collapsed beside a small stream, gasping for air, Charlie's watch showed they'd been running for less than 30 minutes. Time had become elastic in this nightmare, stretching and contracting according to laws that had nothing to do with physics. "We're not going to make it," Sam said, splashing water on his face with shaking hands. "They're playing with us." Pete checked his rifle, counting bullets. "Got maybe 6 shots left." "Dutch?" "4," Dutch replied, his voice flat. 9 bullets between them, and Charlie had seen what a direct hit did to one of these creatures. It had barely slowed it down. A twig snapped in the forest behind them, and they turned as one to see a pair of eyes watching them from the shadows. The creature made no attempt to hide. It simply stood there, patient and still, like a cat watching mice in a trap. "They're waiting for something," Charlie said, the words coming out in a whisper. "For what?" Before Charlie could answer, he heard it, the distant sound of voices calling through the forest. Human voices, growing closer. The creatures had been waiting for reinforcements, and now help was coming. But as the voices grew nearer, Charlie realized with growing horror that they weren't rescue calls. They were screams of terror, and they were getting closer. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The voices in the forest weren't human after all. Charlie's heart sank as he realized the truth. The creatures were mimicking human speech, calling out in perfect imitations of men in distress. The sounds were too perfect, too practiced, as if these beings had been studying human behavior for longer than anyone could imagine. "They're calling us," Pete whispered, his face pale with understanding, "trying to make us think there's help coming." But even knowing it was a trap, the sounds were almost irresistible. Every instinct screamed at Charlie to run toward those voices, to find the other humans who might help them survive this nightmare. It was only the sight of the creature still watching them from the shadows that kept him frozen in place. "How long have they been doing this?" Dutch asked, his voice barely audible. "How many others have they?" He didn't finish the question, but Charlie understood. How many other miners, hunters, travelers had heard those same false calls for help? How many had run toward salvation only to find something else entirely waiting for them? The creature watching them took a step forward, and Charlie could see details that made his skin crawl. Its face was more human than it had any right to be, with features that suggested intelligence and emotion. But the eyes were wrong, too knowing, too calculating. They held the wisdom of ages and the cruelty of something that had never learned mercy. "It's studying us," Sam said, his voice hollow, like we're some kind of experiment. The false human voices grew closer, more urgent. Charlie could make out individual words now. "Help us!" and "over here!" and "they're coming!" delivered in perfect human cadence and inflection. The mimicry was so flawless it made his stomach turn. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, came a sound that froze the blood in his veins. It was Billy's voice, clear as day, calling out, "Charlie, Pete, I'm alive. I'm hurt, but I'm alive. Help me." Pete took an involuntary step toward the sound before catching himself. "That's not Billy," he said, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. "Billy's dead," Charlie said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. We heard him scream, but the voice came again, more desperate this time. "Please, I can't walk. Something's wrong with my leg." It was perfect. Every inflection, every breath, every tremor of fear was exactly as Billy would have sounded. If Charlie hadn't known better, he would have sworn the boy was out there, wounded and terrified, calling for his friends to save him. The creature watching them made that rumbling sound again, the one that might have been laughter. It was enjoying this, Charlie realized. The psychological torture, the way they were being slowly driven mad by their own hope and desperation. "We need to move," Charlie said, forcing himself to turn away from the sounds. "Now, while they're distracted with their games." But as they began to creep away from the stream, the forest around them erupted with activity. Creatures emerged from behind trees, from beneath fallen logs, from shadows that had seemed empty moments before. There were at least 6 of them, all massive, all moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. They had been surrounded the entire time. "Well, hell," Pete said, raising his rifle. "If we're going to die, let's at least make some noise about it." The gunshot echoed through the forest, and one of the creatures staggered but didn't fall. The others didn't even flinch. They simply began to close the circle, moving with the patience of beings who had all the time in the world. Charlie found himself thinking of his wife Mary, waiting for him back in Seattle. She'd be making breakfast about now, probably wondering why his letters had stopped coming. She'd never know what happened to him, never understand that he died in a place that existed outside the normal rules of the world. The creatures were close enough now that he could smell them. That rank, animal odor mixed with something else, something that reminded him of old graves and forgotten places. Their eyes never left the 3 surviving miners, and Charlie could see intelligence there, malevolent and ancient. "They're not going to kill us quickly," Sam said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "They're going to make it last." But as the creatures closed in, something unexpected happened. The largest one, the one that had been watching them from the shadows, suddenly stopped and tilted its head, as if listening to something only it could hear. A moment later, Charlie heard it too, the distant sound of voices, real voices this time, human voices, calling out in the characteristic cadence of a search party. "Hello, anyone out there? We're looking for the miners from Ape Canyon." The creatures froze, their attention turning toward the sound. For the first time since this nightmare began, Charlie saw something like uncertainty in their movements. They were used to being the hunters, not the hunted. The arrival of more humans wasn't part of their plan. The largest creature made a series of guttural sounds, and the others began to melt back into the forest with fluid grace. But before they disappeared entirely, the leader turned back to look at Charlie one last time. Its eyes promised that this wasn't over, that no matter how far they ran, no matter who came to help them, the mountain devils would be waiting. The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that belonged in nightmares. Then it was gone, vanishing into the forest as if it had never been there at all. But Charlie knew better. They would be back, and next time there might not be a search party to interrupt their hunt. Chapter 8. The Telling. 30 years had passed since Ape Canyon, but Charlie Brennan still woke up screaming. The search party had found them that morning in 1924, 3 broken men stumbling through the forest like ghosts. They'd been hailed as heroes in the newspapers, brave miners who'd fought off a pack of wild animals and lived to tell the tale. The reporters had loved the story, especially the part about the mountain devils hurling rocks at their cabin. But Charlie knew the truth was something the world wasn't ready to hear. He sat now in his small apartment in Seattle, the morning light filtering through curtains that hadn't been opened in weeks. The bottle of whiskey on the table was half empty, and it wasn't yet noon. Mary had left him years ago, taking their daughter with her. She'd said she couldn't live with a man who was haunted by shadows. The letter from the university researcher lay open on the table beside the bottle. Dr. Margaret Thorne, Department of Anthropology, requesting an interview about the alleged cryptid encounter at Ape Canyon. She was the 15th academic to contact him over the years, all of them eager to dissect his story and fit it into their neat little categories of folklore and mass hysteria. Charlie laughed bitterly and reached for the bottle. Mass hysteria. If only it were that simple. Pete had died in a logging accident 5 years after the canyon, crushed by a tree that had fallen the wrong way. But Charlie had seen the look in his eyes at the funeral, the same haunted stare they'd all carried since that night. Pete had been watching the tree line, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. Dutch had lasted longer, but the drink had taken him eventually. He'd spent his final years in a sanatorium, raving about creatures that walked upright and threw rocks with the precision of artillery. The doctors had called it delayed trauma, but Charlie knew better. Dutch had been remembering. Sam had simply vanished one day, walked out of his house in Spokane, and never came back. They'd found his truck abandoned near the Cascade Mountains, but no trace of Sam himself. The official report blamed exposure, but Charlie knew where Sam had gone. He'd gone back to find them, to settle the score that had been eating at him for decades. Charlie picked up the letter again, reading Dr. Thorne's carefully worded questions. She wanted to know about the psychological factors that had led to their shared delusion. She wanted to understand how three grown men could convince themselves they'd encountered something that science said couldn't exist. But science was a narrow window, and there were things in the world that couldn't be seen through it. Things that had learned to stay hidden, to avoid the cameras and the hunting parties and the curious academics who wanted to study them like specimens. The phone rang, jarring Charlie from his thoughts. He let it ring for a long moment before answering, knowing who it would be. "Mr. Brennan?" The voice was young, female, eager. "This is Dr. Thorne from the university. I was hoping we could schedule that interview." "I told you in my letter," Charlie said, his voice rough from years of whiskey and cigarettes. "I don't talk about Ape Canyon. But Mr. Brennan, your story could be invaluable to our understanding of—" "Understanding?" Charlie laughed, the sound empty and bitter. "You want to understand? Then listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." He could hear her fumbling for a pen, the scratch of paper as she prepared to take notes. "There are places in this world where the rules don't apply," Charlie said. "Places where things live that were never meant to be cataloged or studied or explained away. And some of those things are smarter than us, older than us, and they remember every slight, every intrusion, every act of disrespect." "Mr. Brennan, I'm not sure I follow. You want to know what happened at Ape Canyon? We trespassed. We went where we weren't wanted, and we paid the price. But the real price wasn't what happened to us that night. The real price is what's been happening ever since." Charlie walked to the window, peering through the curtains at the street below. A figure stood on the corner, tall and broad, partially hidden in the shadows between streetlights. It had been there for 3 days now, watching, waiting. "They're still out there," Charlie whispered into the phone. "Still watching, still remembering. And every few years, when the story gets told again, when someone new starts asking questions, they come closer to the world we know." "Mr. Brennan, are you all right? I sound like a man who's been marked," Charlie said. "Like a man who's been carrying a secret for 30 years, and that secret is getting heavier every day." He hung up the phone and walked back to his chair, not bothering to close the curtains. The figure on the corner hadn't moved, but Charlie could feel its attention like a physical weight. It knew he was watching. It wanted him to know it was there. The bottle was empty now, but it didn't matter. All the whiskey in the world couldn't wash away what he'd seen in those intelligent eyes, couldn't erase the sound of Billy's voice calling for help long after Billy was dead. Charlie Brennan closed his eyes and waited for the darkness to claim him, knowing that when it did, he might finally stop running from the shadows of Ape Canyon. Outside, the figure on the corner stepped into the light for just a moment, revealing a face that was almost human, but not quite. Then it melted back into the shadows, patient as stone, eternal as the mountains that had given it birth. The mountain devils remembered everything, and they never forgot a debt.